For founders, the biggest piece of advice I usually have is do not surround yourself with yes people or not yes people only. So that's one of the biggest things, because what that means is if you are conscious of having people around you that are going to call you out or maybe show your blind spots, you're already more likely to set things up in a way that sets the organization up to thrive.
You're listening to Let's Imagine, an Imagine Canada podcast for everyone interested in social issues and the nonprofit sector. I'm your host, Bruce MacDonald. At Imagine Canada, we believe that by leveraging our national vantage point, building cross-sector relationships, and sharing and developing our knowledge base, we can advance social, economic, and environmental justice through our collective action. Join us as we dive deep into conversations that have big implications for the nonprofit and charitable sector here in Canada. A special thank you to our supporting partner, Carter's Professional Corporation. Together, let's imagine a stronger future. Founders are often the spark that launches nonprofit organizations. Their vision, passion, and relentless drive help them turn ideas into reality and meet pressing community needs. But as many of us know, founder-led organizations face unique challenges, from blurred roles between board and management to the risks of founder syndrome. Without careful attention to governance and succession, even the strongest organizations can stumble. In this episode of the Let's Imagine podcast, we're joined by Dr. Susanna Kislenko. Susanna is a governance researcher and practitioner affiliated with the University of Oxford and Carleton University, and co-author of Imagine Canada's recently released guide, Good Governance and Leadership in Founder-Led Organizations. She has studied the dynamics of founder-led nonprofits in depth and brings insights into how founders and boards can work together to create resilient, thriving organizations. Welcome, Susanna, and thanks for joining us here today.
Thank you, Bruce. It's a pleasure to be here.
So let's start with the big picture. Why did you personally decide to focus on founder-led organizations as an area of study?
So there are really two reasons why I do what I do. One comes from my first career, which was working in the nonprofit sector in Canada, where I worked with a number of founders and first heard the term founder syndrome and experienced it firsthand. And when I started to look into it, I realized there wasn't a lot of actually formal research on the topic and its effects. And so then when I did decide to become an academic, a researcher, then I realized that actually most of the research on founders is mostly about the beginning part, the startup section. And so much of the research is just about how do you get a vision to fruition, which is obviously very important, but it's almost like, then you fell down a cliff if you continue to be the leader of your organization. So that's what really fuels my research.
That's great. And we're going to talk specifically about founder syndrome in a minute, but I got a question for you before we get there. Founder-led organizations, they really bring enormous energy and vision as these individuals. They're entrepreneurs and they get things started. But your research shows they also face distinct governance challenges. So what makes their governance context different from other nonprofits?
Yeah, there are obviously common governance challenges across all organizations, even organizations that aren't founder-led. But what makes founder-led organizations unique is the level of control that a founder can exert. And when we're thinking about the board, it is the founder who created the first board, right? Who selected the initial board members. And so that in and of itself imprints where the organization is going to go. And it also sets the tone for how the board often functions from that moment on. So in many of the founder-led organizations that we've studied, the founder continues to select the board members and continues to sort of dictate where the board goes in its direction. And when it comes to governance, that can be a real problem.
Yeah, it's interesting. We often see that kind of board creation through an executive director in established organizations as well. But I think to your point, it's really acute in founder-started organizations because they're literally the ones going and finding those initial boards. The question, I guess, in part is, do they transition at any point into kind of a more, I don't know if this is the right word, but more of a more mainstream approach? And that kind of takes us towards this idea of founder syndrome, which in the recently released guide, it really talks about it. But there may be listeners who are just not familiar with it. Can you explain what it is, why it matters, and how good governance can act as a safeguard against founder syndrome before problems really take root?
Yeah, absolutely. So, we spoke earlier about this idea of founder leadership or leadership as a whole that is might be different during the startup stage versus the later stages of the organization. And it's founder syndrome really comes into play after startup. So basically, when the organization is growing and ready to scale and kind of heading into maturity, if the founder continues to be the leader but doesn't ask very important questions around, are they still the right leader? If they are, do they maybe need to upgrade their skills or bring someone else in to support them? Where do they need to delegate? Those kinds of questions. And so if that shift doesn't happen right after startup, that's where founder syndrome can take place. So founder syndrome is essentially when the founder wants to maintain control of all levels of the organization. And so how this plays out is in the beginning, that might be okay because also the organization is short staffed, usually anyway, in the beginning. But as we're thinking about 10, 20, 30 years in, if everything continues to be run through the founder, that's where it becomes a problem. That's where we have not only bottlenecks, but all kinds of other leadership and organizational challenges that can happen. And, the impact of that is multifold. Like there's so many impacts of the founder trying and kind of like grasping to maintain control at all costs. And this is where good governance and particularly the board understanding what their role is supposed to be and that their role is truly to oversee the work of the founder and to make sure the organization as a whole is doing all right and doing well. So good governance in this sense becomes critical, and that's really why we wrote the guide.
Yeah, this is super helpful. Yeah, I'm curious as to your perspective on where outside influences play a role in perpetuating founder syndrome. I'm curious, particularly around the fundraising perspective, because often, to your point, like it's not necessarily about control per se, but the relationships are formed often between the founder and those supporters who they've brought on because they bought into this exciting vision. Do you see instances where the actual supporters themselves struggle to let go of the relationship with the founder and support the cause beyond that?
What a great question. Thank you for asking that, Bruce. Yes, yes, and yes. I think about this all the time, actually. What I found in my research, actually, in my dissertation, in fact, was that founders with founder syndrome often want to maintain a certain image in the public eye. And there's often a social structure that is created around them. And part of this social structure is the stakeholders that you're talking about. And so, absolutely. I mean, if we look at the We Charity scandal, there's not a more obvious case of that, right? And why things were allowed to go on for as long as they did and why the public was not aware of what was going on and that kind of thing. So absolutely, there's a reciprocal relationship there. And in fact, that's why I often call it the founder ecosystem, because it is absolutely not just about the founder as an individual, because also an individual can only do so much if they're not supported by the system around them.
You know, it's interesting. We've seen instances over the years of organizations who have struggled to move from founder to beyond founder. And we've seen others who've done really wonderful jobs. And I mean, I think one of the strongest messages in the guide is about succession planning, starting early and viewing it as a measure of founder success, which is a really interesting way of thinking about it. So, why is succession such a persistent challenge in our sector? And how can boards and founders approach it differently?
Yeah, we spend quite a bit of space on succession planning in the guide for a number of reasons. First of all, even when succession planning is happening in the nonprofit sector, it seems to sometimes happen kind of last minute, sometimes haphazardly, and where people don't feel supported. And so, one of the things that we found is that people don't even know where to go for support around how to start to think about succession planning. So, that's one of the factors. I think the other factor when we are thinking of issues such as founder syndrome or anything like that is a founder may not want to talk about their own mortality or the idea of succession or the idea of giving up power in any way. There's a reason why, I love the show Succession because it's the best example that fictional character, which is, of course, based on a number of real people in the world, truly refuses to consider the possibility that they will not be alive at some point. And what ends up happening in that story is he ends up dying without a successor, really. And the organization kind of crumbles afterward. And so it's almost like this kind of dark, scarier topic for some reason, even though it's something every organization has to face at some point. And so part of what we wanted to do with the guide, and when I talk about we, of course, I talk about my co-author, Kathy Barr, is we wanted to empower both founders and board members to start to have these conversations early, even if they feel a little bit scary. There's a case I have in mind, an organization that I know in Canada where I was privy to some of the conversations that were happening with the founder and the board members, and his succession planning is about 5 years out. And also his top execs were also in the meeting. So I think there's really something to starting the conversations early because it will dissipate the fear that people might have about the founder leaving.
Well, this actually might be the first Let's Imagine podcast where we have to lead with a spoiler alert in terms of the plot line of the television show Succession, because I think it's going to be important that people don't tune in and then realize I haven't seen the show. So that's a great one. But it's interesting too, as you're talking about this, it strikes me that so much of the founder transition conversation is about self-awareness. And, often I've heard that founders derive great joy from the early days, the building phase, the wildly entrepreneurial phase. And then there becomes this kind of law of diminishing marginal returns, where over time, as the systems become more formal, as others are participating more, it becomes less satisfying in some cases based on the actual personality of the founder. So this idea of starting succession early, I think also speaks to a level of self-awareness by the very founders themselves.
Absolutely.
I think one of the nice things that the guide has done is also made a link between the standards accreditation program that was created for the sector by the sector that Imagine Canada now runs. And that program has long emphasized the importance of clear roles between boards and staff. So what are some of the practical steps that founders and boards can take to clarify those roles in the early years of an organization's existence?
Yeah, this is where, it was so valuable to have Kathy as the co-author in this publication, but with such depth of knowledge as one of the sort of parents of the standards program, because it emphasizes so much, the standards program, the element of being intentional from the beginning about writing down what the parameters are going to be around the board, what are going to be, how often are you going to meet, what are the bylaws. And I think, the other thing is some of these smaller elements that are quite practical and that are sometimes happening in organizations, but actually they're not going to lead to the best outcomes. So for example, there are organizations that will put the founder on the board. And sometimes the justification at the beginning of the organization is the founder might not even be paid yet, or there might not be anyone else. But delineating that from day one, that the founder as the leader is responsible for management, whereas the board is responsible for governance, is critical because, again, it sets the tone for everything that comes after that.
Yeah, and certainly I hear as founders are transitioning during some of these sort of thoughtful processes that they may have played the executive director or CEO role for a while, and then as they are exiting the paid staff position role, they may move into a board position to be able to provide that wisdom and expertise. But those are generally those thoughtful, positive exits where they're really sitting there and saying, I'd love to be able to contribute, but I recognize that it's time to hand the baton to someone else. And so like governance is not just about process. It's about preventing real harm. So what happens when a founder holds too much unchecked power? Are there any examples, without naming organizations or individuals, of the damage that poor governance in a founder-led organization can cause to their staff, to their boards, or even the communities that they seek to serve?
I've been studying this for over a decade now, and I'm still surprised by the depth of impact this can have. And a couple of the organizations actually I have in mind can be named because they're the ones that are in the public sphere. So We Charity, I've already mentioned, we obviously know the outcomes of that. In the US, I often talk about Elizabeth Holmes and the Theranos story. If people are aware, that's the blood testing company where where it was the board members actually that really allowed it to continue for a decade, where it turned out to be fraudulent completely. And of course, she's in prison now. And those are extreme cases. However, what I often see, and it's way too common, is a great deal of harmful leadership practices that are really harmful to people within the organization. Board member abuse, sometimes funder abuse, not abuse in a violent sense, but more of a manipulation because there's so much of a belief in the founder and that they can do no wrong. And the other thing that I have seen is the longer these dynamics are going on. So for example, We Charity was more, a couple of decades, more than a couple of decades. And so the longer they stay ingrained, the harder it is to call things out. So one of the things that, we definitely advise in the guide, and I always kind of like to speak about, is to call things out if you're seeing them. And people often in these kinds of organizations might have a fear around that, but it's critical to do that because then maybe problems can be prevented earlier on.
I just want to make sure I interpreted one of your statements correctly. So you talked about, potentially funders or board directors and the harms that are created. Did I understand that correctly, that you're suggesting that they may in fact be creating harm because of their support of the founder?
Kind of in reverse. So actually, that too. Yeah, in fact, that's actually another study that Kathy and I want to do around the role of the funders, actually, because there's definitely a dynamic happening there. So yes, harm can be caused in terms of providing resources to someone unknowingly, to someone who might be doing something fraudulent with them. But what I had in mind when I was making that statement was that founders can sometimes spin things a certain way for a long-term funder. And it may sound one way to the funder and it may sound above board, but in truth, they're actually being manipulated by the founder. And I know this is a little dark, but so are some of these topics. So it's more that, especially when there's a long-term trusted relationship, sometimes if someone wants to take advantage of that, that can happen.
That's helpful. Thank you. So we're going to speak now about two particular audiences. So the first we're going to start with is the founders themselves. So for those who are tuning into this podcast, some of them may already be feeling overwhelmed with the magnitude of the work that they're doing. What's the one piece of advice you'd give them to start building healthier governance practices in their organization?
For founders, the biggest piece of advice I usually have is do not surround yourself with yes people, or not yes people only. So that's one of the biggest things, because what that means is if you are conscious of having people around you that are going to call you out or maybe show your blind spots, you're already more likely to set things up in a way that sets the organization up to thrive. But the other thing is also about what you mentioned earlier, which is one of my favorite things to think about, and a term I think is really important, which is self-awareness. So the idea is, can you as a leader, as a founder, continue to always question yourself and question whether just because you did something the same way 5 years ago, whether it should still be done in the same way? Also, who are you talking about? Oh, who are you talking to about some of your decisions? Do you have a deep understanding of what your staff needs, what your stakeholders need, what your beneficiaries need? So I think the biggest thing for founders And I would also say, especially first-time founders, because sometimes people can get caught up in this idea of what it means to be a founder. And, we have a lot of sort of like images in pop culture about what that is and how exciting that can be, when a lot of us know that the reality of being a founder is very gritty and very tough, especially in the beginning. So this idea, I think, of just staying grounded and staying committed to the mission and to the whole reason why you started the organization in the first place, those are probably some of the things that I would advise for founders.
Yeah, I gather there's likely a ton of parallels to small business entrepreneurs in terms of their initial startup phase, the drive to do it, the humility they start with, and then seeing how success might change that over time. So I think that self-awareness piece comes into it. So let's think a little bit about board directors now. For those who are on boards of founder-led organizations, what do they need to know most in order to provide effective oversight while still supporting the founder's vision?
Yeah. From the board member's perspective, I think it's kind of exactly what you said, in that kind of holding both at the same time. So to truly honor the founder's vision and absolutely, obviously not put that aside, but at the same time, to ensure that the checks and balances are happening within the organization, some that may need to happen that are actually outside the board, but that the board can have some say in, and then within the board themselves, and to keep the communication open. In a lot of the organizations where we've seen problems, it's because there's a level of siloness, if that's a word, silos. It's siloed, and there's secrecy going on. So there's a real lack of transparency. For board members, it's to what I said a little earlier, to call things out if they're seeing them, if something doesn't feel right, but also to make sure that they're getting all the information they might need. And if they have questions about something, not to be, sort of shy or fearful about digging a little bit deeper to get the answers.
Yeah, that's great. It's interesting. We're going to wrap up the podcast with a classic question that we ask all of our guests. But it's interesting. You've been studying this field for a while, and every organization started somewhere. Somebody had an idea. So as you look ahead, what gives you hope about the future of founder-led organizations in Canada?
Bruce, primarily what gives me hope is these conversations, to be honest. I'm very grateful that we are in a place now where people are open to these kinds of conversations, where things are being questioned from a few different perspectives. And so what gives me hope is that maybe as a collective, we can sort of poke holes in some of the myths that have existed about founders or what a founder-led organization is supposed to look like. And in that way, some of the scandals that have happened, like, I think that's the silver lining in them, is that if it's leading to these bigger conversations, then we're moving forward, right? Then there's hope in the future. So, and my goal with everything I do is to start conversations. So that's what I'm most hopeful for.
That's wonderful. And I think for me, this idea of now having this guide, so for organizations to maybe avoid issues that they might not even be aware that they're starting to slip into. It's such a wonderful gift. And just as a reminder for our listeners, you can download the full resource, Good Governance and Leadership in Founder-Led Organizations, on the Imagine Canada website. It's full of practical guidance for founders, boards, and really anyone working in governance. And with that, thank you, Susanna, for sharing your insights and for co-authoring such an important resource for our sector. I think it is going to get widespread use.
Oh, thank you for having me, Bruce, and it's been a true pleasure to speak with you.
Thanks for listening to the Let's Imagine podcast. For full show notes and to subscribe to our newsletter so you never miss an episode, please visit our website, www.imaginecanada.ca. Also, if you really like this episode, we invite you to leave us a 5-star review wherever you listen to this podcast, as this helps other people discover us and engage in these conversations. And again, thanks to our sponsor, Carter's Professional Corporation, for supporting our podcast.